the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm excited to be with you today as we do this webinar on trans-inclusive language and practices. I'm here with a group of students who are peer educators who are doing this webinar as a part of a course that they're taking. I've got with me Max, Rebecca, and Yosef. They'll introduce themselves in a moment. Again, my name is Nick. I go by they and them pronouns. I've been working on this campus for about 7 years now, and have been working in LGBT issues in higher education professionally since 2003, and as a student activist before then. As you can see on this slide, we're inviting you, if you want to, share your name, your department, unit, or program, and pronouns that you go by. Please just keep in mind we are recording this session, and so the things that go into the chat box become part of that recording. So the flow for the discussion today, we're going to start with a little bit of more introduction, and then I'll turn it over to our peer educators who will be talking about why that we're talking about this topic, go into a bit more depth on pronouns. We'll talk about gender assumptive language or binary assumptive language. They'll go a little bit into talking about restrooms and inclusion in restrooms, and then I'll wrap us up with some resources, some Q&A time, and then some action steps. Now, if you have questions, we would love any questions that you have throughout the entire session. We may not be able to get to everything in the moment, but we definitely invite you to share your questions in the chat box and to make this a participatory learning experience for those who are live on the webinar session. As I mentioned, this is being presented by peer educators and also by myself as a staff member in the LGBT Equity Center. As far as ground rules, just being really respectful for each other in the chat box for sure, but also what we have to say we hope is good, useful, helpful advice. As many of you know, Rainbow Terrapin Network is all about folks who are interested in going above and beyond and really learning ways that we can be more inclusive. You don't have to agree to every single point that we have to share, but we definitely hope that you'll take all of these things into consideration as you work to create a more inclusive campus environment. With that, I want to mention that there is another webinar that preceded this one, which was on LGBTQ+ terminology and concepts. And so in this webinar, as you saw in the flow, we're not spending a whole lot of time talking about terminology. So it may be useful at some point to go back and see that recording. We can send that out to folks after this webinar. And being able to review all that terminology can be very, very helpful. Just making sure that you understand, when we're talking about trans issues and non-binary issues, we're talking about gender. And that doesn't necessarily have to do directly with who that you're attracted to romantically or sexually, but that's simply how that you see yourself. And of course, there are many different terms that we'll be using throughout this that we explain in much more depth in that other webinar. That said, if you do have a question about something that we're talking about, you're not sure what we mean, again, feel free to ask that in the chat box. Throughout the session, I'll probably be asking some of our presenters some questions, and you can ask them some questions, and I'll probably be peppering in some ideas as well. As I mentioned, this is the sort of flow of the presentation today, and the intended audience is University of Maryland, College Park, student, staff, and faculty. And again, we're not going to be able to do and answer everything today, but please see this as a starting point and not an end point in this discussion. Thanks for those who are introducing themselves. I see we've got a variety of people here. I know some people are on a single connection but may have many people in the room, but we have folks from all over campus, and based on the registrations, everything from undergrads to grad students, staff, faculty, and from many, many different colleges. So thank you for being here today and taking this time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the students to also maybe if everyone can introduce themselves before we get right into the why this matters.
Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca. I'm a senior psychology major. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a peer educator with the LGBT Speakers Bureau, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Hello everyone, my name is Max. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a senior psychology and philosophy double major LGBT studies certificate. I am also one of the peer educators for the LGBT Equity Center's Speakers Bureau, and I'm also excited to get this started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Yosef. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a senior studying literature as well as a peer educator for the Speakers Bureau, and I am also very excited to go on this journey with you all.
So, before we get into this presentation, we thought it would be good to talk a little bit about why we decided to create this webinar and why talking about transgender, genderqueer, and non-binary people matters. So, first of all, as national research projects and surveys have consistently found, transgender people face discrimination, harassment, and injustice in many aspects of their lives. Anti-transgender biases and practices pervade the education system, the criminal justice system, workplaces, healthcare offices, housing, and countless other notable aspects of life in the United States. Specifically, harassment and discrimination can be particularly devastating in schools. 82% of transgender youth report feeling unsafe at their schools. A vast majority of trans kids report they have been harassed at school, while many others note that they have either been physically or sexually assaulted in their school settings. Due to such cases of severe harassment and violence in schools, almost 1/6, which is around 15% of trans students, decided to or were forced to leave their schools. So while students who suffer at the hands of their peers are highly affected, kids who have been harassed and assaulted by teachers in their schools show dramatically worse mental and physical health outcomes. When transgender youth feel unsafe at school, they are more likely to miss school and have significantly lower GPAs than their peers. And all of these factors in combination make education settings very unsafe for trans students and make these students less likely to continue their education. Another important institution we thought we would note are workplaces. So outside of school, the workplace is another area where these high rates of discrimination and harassment against trans, genderqueer, and non-binary people exist. A vast majority of trans adults report experiencing harassment, mistreatment, and discrimination at their places of work. These forms include being fired, not being hired, or being denied a promotion based solely on their gender identity because they're trans, non-binary, or genderqueer. Because of employment discrimination and harassment in the workplace, many transgender people experience unemployment and poverty. One sample of trans respondents found that they experienced unemployment at twice the rate of the general population and were nearly 4 times more likely to have a household income of less than $10,000 a year compared to the general population. It's also important to note that schools and workplaces are just two of the numerous institutions that proliferate discrimination and violence against trans people. However, when institutions make the effort to create supportive, inclusive, and accepting environments for trans youths and adults, we see the opposite effects compared to everything that I just mentioned. When trans adults and students feel safe, comfortable, and accepted in their environments, they can work and live more efficiently. Notably, creating trans inclusive environments in schools improve educational outcomes for all students, not just those who are transgender, non-binary, or genderqueer. So, all in all, the goal of this webinar is to encourage you to practice trans inclusion and combat transphobia in all of your spaces so that transgender, genderqueer, and non-binary students at this university and beyond can thrive in their lives.
Thank you.
So, one of the aspects of speaking with trans inclusive language is pronouns. So, what are pronouns? Pronouns are how we refer to people when we don't use their name. And when we talk about pronouns, we usually structure them in a subject, object, possessive format. What I mean by that is, for example, the sentence, she is home, she is the subject. The sentence, her eyes gleamed with delight, her is the object. And the sentence, that backpack is hers, hers is possessive. So some examples of pronouns can be she, her, hers, and he, him, his. These are the most common pronouns. Other examples may be they, them, theirs, am, airs, sie, here, heres, and they, them, theirs. These are examples of gender-neutral pronouns or just simply pronouns that aren't he, him, she, her. So singular they, them is something that a lot of people are not familiar with. I will, okay. So they, them can be used in both a plural and singular form. Despite rules set by rigid grammarians, the use of they, them as singular to reference someone whose sex or gender is unknown has a long history that includes authors such as Chaucer, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Thackeray, and Shaw. This history stretches back to the 14th century. We frequently use it colloquially in sentences such as, everyone should love their mother, where one is singular and their refers back to one.
So in this discussion of pronouns, it's important to note that an individual's pronouns are not the same thing as their gender identity. Remember our previous definition, pronouns are simply what we would like other people to use to describe us when they're not using our names. Pronouns are not indicators of gender identity. For example, when a trans or genderqueer person tells you her pronouns are she, her, hers, all that means is that the pronouns she would like you to use are she, her, hers. It does not mean that she necessarily identifies as a woman. For this reason, we introduce our pronouns by using actual words like my pronouns are she, her, hers, or they, them, theirs. If someone asks us for pronouns or we're introducing ourselves with our pronouns, we wouldn't refer to our pronouns as female or feminine pronouns or male or masculine pronouns. Because, as I just mentioned, pronouns do not reflect gender identity and therefore would not inherently be male or masculine or female or feminine, even if they were he, him, his, or she, her, hers. Another important point to make about pronouns that we will kind of elaborate on a little bit later is that people may use different pronouns in different settings. For example, Sam may use they, them, theirs when they are out and about at school with their friends, but they might also use he, him, his pronouns when they are at home with family. An individual might be out in some settings but not others, which is why they might use different pronouns for those settings. And we'll kind of get into talking about pronouns and what to do if you have made a mistake or if others have made a mistake in a couple of slides.
So at this moment, we're going to talk about we're going to be talking about ways to introduce pronouns, introduce your own pronouns as well as the people around you. So a really important way to kind of introduce your pronouns for the first time on a one-on-one basis is kind of just simply saying, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I go by they pronouns. How should I refer to you? This is just a kind of way to normalize this type of understanding of pronouns, a way of acknowledging other people's pronouns, and learning more about this process and normalizing these concepts of pronouns.
We don't ever recommend forcing people to share their pronouns. However, people could be invited or encouraged to do so. In a group setting where you are a leader, here's one example of how you could conduct a round of introductions. Welcome to our meeting. Before we begin, we'd like to go around and share our names and personal pronouns. For those who haven't done this before, this is a way that we can avoid assumptions, particularly about gender. What may seem obvious may actually be incorrect, and please keep in mind that while many people associate he or she as meaning men or women respectively, this isn't always the case. This is not about sharing your gender or private information. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm only asking for which pronouns you want to be referred to by, because these are a part of the English language and how we typically refer to people. So for most people, that means they either go by she and her pronouns or they go by he and him pronouns. Some people go by they and them pronouns, or another set of pronouns, or another way of being referred to. However, for most people in this room, you'd simply say something like, hi, I'm Leslie and I go by he pronouns, or hi, I'm Jamie and I go by she pronouns, and then turn to the next person. If you don't understand what I'm asking, or if you feel that you are uncomfortable sharing or unable to participate in a respectful way, it's okay to just share your name. But if you feel comfortable to share, and you know that typically you go by a certain set of pronouns and are good with that, let us know. Please also keep in mind that what people in this room share today is just what people are sharing today in this space and time, and that people may change their names or pronouns or go by different ones in another space. Does anyone have a question before we begin our introductions?
So that would be an example of how that you could introduce it if you're leading a group or a classroom, different kinds of settings like that. Yeah?
Yeah.
Great.
And as we introduce our pronouns, we typically try to stay away from calling our preferred pronouns. Of course, when we call our pronouns preferred, we imply that that there's a choice in the matter, or that that it trivializes this concept of that there's a choice and that there are other options in terms of what pronouns people choose from. Whatever pronouns a trans or binary or genderqueer person asks you to use, they are the only pronouns that you should use. Of course, mistakes happen, and I'm about to kind of read you an example of what you should do if you make a mistake. First and foremost, you should definitely try to make a big deal about it. But here's just an example that I'll be reading. You're talking about someone who goes by he, him pronouns. And then you say, she is a great student. I'm sorry, I meant to say he is a great student. He's been reading all of the assignments very thoroughly, and it's been a pleasure to work with him. You don't have to make a big deal about your mistake or draw a lot of attention to it. You mostly need to fix it. You might have a follow-up conversation with the person you referred to incorrectly to apologize or see if there's something else you can do to correct it moving forward in the future. But making a big deal about it at the moment is not necessarily helpful and could actually be harmful unless that's what the person who was incorrectly referred to wants. Depending on the situation, you might be worried that people think you aren't being friendly towards transgender people because you made a mistake. But generally, it's good to avoid making the situation about you and your intent. A good way to show you are friendly is to get it right in the future and to act upon some of the other guidances you may find through this website or other resources.
So we've talked a bit about pronouns. I'm wondering, from the folks that are listening to this, is this something that you're comfortable with? Is this something you're familiar with? We'd love to have any questions, thoughts that you have about how that you talk about pronouns, concerns that have come up when you're introducing the concept of pronouns to people that might not be familiar with it. If it's new for you, what questions you have about it. So if you do have a question, now is a great time. Please feel free to type something into the chat box. We would love to answer to that. One thing I've heard folks say when we've done some of these kinds of trainings is just, it feels like I'm sharing something really personal, or I'm asking people to share something that, that's private information. How would you respond to that kind of question?
I feel that this fear that asking for pronouns could potentially out people is not necessarily based in much of my reality. I know that when people do ask me for my pronouns, I don't feel like they're asking me if I'm transgender. I feel like they are expressing that they are familiar with transgender people, they're familiar with how to make us feel included in their spaces, and they're not necessarily asking me to say, like, hey, I am transgender, here are my pronouns, because they've normalized the practice of asking everyone who enters their space for their pronouns.
Yeah, absolutely. To reiterate what Max just said, I think it's a good practice to ask everyone for their pronouns. Don't single people out. If they look a certain way and you're like, oh, I'm not sure about what those pronouns could be, that's not what we want to do at all. And kind of in the same vein, the point we mentioned earlier about people who might use different pronouns in different settings, when you believe that someone else has made a mistake and you're perhaps using different pronouns than the person you're talking to about a mutual friend or a mutual acquaintance, we always advise that you go with gentle reinforcement as opposed to directly correcting someone. So when you're talking, always use the pronouns that you know to be correct about your friend or about your acquaintance, but just be aware they might not be out to other people or they might not be using the same pronouns in other settings. So it's better to just use it in the way that you're talking and perhaps not make a big deal about it, say, stop the conversation and directly correct others.
And I would add on to that, in a situation where you don't know what pronouns someone uses, they, them is a safe gender neutral way to refer to people without misgendering them until you actually know their pronouns. So if I didn't know Rebecca's pronouns, for example, or if I forgot them, I would refer to Rebecca with they, them pronouns until I could check in and see what pronouns are they using lately.
We did have a question on the chat box here, which is just how do you approach sharing pronouns on behalf of others? So, for example, if a student tells me their pronouns but haven't necessarily shared that with others, how do I refer to that student while being respectful of them? Because it sounds like in this question, maybe part of it is, well, part of it is, first of all, I want to say we all have pronouns, right? Not just trans and non-binary people, but all people have pronouns that they go by. They just usually don't think about that and tell that to other people. I'm hearing in this question that maybe the person is trans or non-binary, and sort of there's some question about whether using the pronoun somebody just shared might out them. That might be a piece of that question. What do you all think about that? Yes, and they say yes. That's a piece of that question. Yeah.
Well, I would assume that if this student, well, I'm making assumptions here. I think you're a professor because you're talking about a student, or maybe some sort of faculty member. If that student has shared with you their personal pronouns, I would assume it's what they want to go by when they're in your class, in your workplace, in your presence. So I would just use that around them, use that with their fellow students, around their colleagues. Does that answer the question? Maybe more.
I think it does, but I also think that this is something that could be handled on a more of an individual basis based on the context in which the student tells you their pronouns. If it's a student you're not particularly close to, or a student you're just meeting for the first time, they tell you these are the pronouns they want to use in class, then I think you could just use that safely in that classroom setting, etc. But if it's a student that you're talking to in confidence about it, then it would be a good idea to ask, oh, if it's a student who's telling you about their pronouns in a more of a confidential setting, it would be a good idea to ask the student, are these pronouns that I can use in public spaces, or is this pronouns just for this particular space, etc. Like, it's always a good idea just to communicate around confusions or potential like areas for mistakes.
And we were talking a bit earlier about it is a sort of a fine line of understanding, but I think we talked about pronouns are not necessarily gender, right? Now, some of you all were saying that you know pronouns don't have to be masculine or have to be feminine or gender neutral. I mean, there could be a woman who uses they them, or or that's one of the sets of pronouns that they like to go by. There could be like there could be a trans man that goes by she her pronouns. There could be any number of reasons for that, but it could also be that they don't want to talk about being a trans man, and think that using she her pronouns might help for safety reasons. So pronouns are really just language in the way that we refer to people. Although I'd say also some people see them as masculine or feminine for themselves. We just have to think about kind of generalizations that we make when we're talking to other people or just sharing about pronouns in general. We have some more questions coming in here. One more question at least, but which is, should I avoid using pronouns until I know which pronoun to use? And if I make a mistake, should I correct myself or just move on?
I can answer that from at least my own experience. So the first part of that question was,
so what do you use if you're not sure of pronouns? So that we were just saying to use they them pronouns as a good option. Are there other good options that any of you suggest?
I do recommend using they them pronouns as a safe gender neutral term over just using the person's name every time in place of a pronoun, because that's a little more noticeable than we would think. And when you're speaking about other students or people and you're not doing the same practice, then it kind of singles that one person out. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
I'm
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, I agree as well. I think.
so I think one thing that would concern me is when we're really inconsistent, right? So I think it's important not just to be sensitive to people that you think are trans or non-binary, but any person that you meet could be trans or non-binary or could be cisgender, and you don't really know that. And just making assumptions based on how people appear could also be really uncomfortable. So, I think the recommendation would be to try to apply that kind of guidance to all interactions, not just with people that you think might be trans, but that you're really, I think opening the conversation first by sharing your own pronouns, and after that, then, inviting others to share what pronouns they go by as well, but not just, asking only people that you think might be trans what their pronouns are. That this is something that we're working to make just a part of the culture of how we talk, because pronouns are part of the English language, and so it's really just embedded in all of our conversation. And again, to go back and say, what pronoun that you identify with is not the same as what your gender is, right? And whether you're trans or not. And everyone has pronouns, whether they're trans or cisgender or non-binary, whatever identities that you hold. We typically have pronouns. Some people just go by their name. That's okay too. But generally in English, pronouns exist, right? And so I would say, back to the original person's question about, you know, how to handle sharing what someone else has told you. If it's about pronouns, that typically is fine, unless the person says, "Oh, I only go by that in this space," or you can tell that the person is nervous about sharing what they really want to be referred to by. Those might be indicators that actually maybe that's private information for that space. But generally, pronouns are fairly public, right? It's how we're talking about people. This is not the same as if somebody discloses to you, "I'm trans," right? You don't go and tell that to other people. So, unless that's sort of very clear permission to go and tell that information, to be really thoughtful that that tends to be private information that's about your identity, and those kinds of things. Pronouns don't have to be about your identity, although often they are related. Um, and then the other question was just about what you do if you make a mistake, and of course, we recommend that people should correct themselves, but also that unless there's a reason, that other person is concerned, usually not making it a big deal is probably okay. Um,
Yeah, just to elaborate on that, if you make a mistake and then it's all of these theatrics, you're so sorry, oh my goodness, and then a week later you're still talking about it, then it becomes about you as opposed to about the person, and now they're comforting you. They have to tell you it's fine, and it's just this whole act that we don't want to get into. So, and it brings more attention, perhaps unwanted attention, to the individual who you made the mistake about.
So we're going to shift into talking about binary assumptive language a little bit. If there are more questions about pronouns, feel free to ask those in the chat box, and we may have a moment for that when we get to the Q&A section.
All right. So the binary in the phrase binary assumptive language refers to the gender binary. And the gender binary is the belief that there are only two distinct genders, male and female, which are determined by an individual's sex characteristics. This is just one type of gender system. There are many others that exist in this world. So we're going to go into some examples of binary assumptive terms, but binary assumptive terms are words or phrases that erase or exclude people who do not identify within this gender binary.
So, as Max was talking about binary assumptive terms, some of those terms that manifest themselves, whether it's in the classroom or outside of the classroom, are ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, sir and madam. And as we have seen, this may be problematic for some people that don't identify within that gender binary that it prevails in our society. And so some of the gender inclusive alternatives may be esteemed guest, folks, friends, colleagues, y'all. Just some things that can create a more equal and open-minded environment for everyone in the classroom.
One of them I see here is MX. What does that mean? How do you say that?
So MX is a gender inclusive alternative to Mr., Miss, Mrs. That, I mean, you can say in conversation, but primarily it's written on paper, right? If we're addressing letters to people, and it's pronounced mix.
There.
Awesome. So to expand upon the sort of elements of language we mentioned in the previous slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some practices in your everyday life that you can maybe try to challenge and avoid in order to be more gender inclusive. So the first one is very common. We hear this all the time. I'm sure some of us in this room are even guilty of it, but challenge yourself to stop saying guys or dudes when addressing a group. Another idea would be to avoid classroom activities, or I don't know if, what kinds of people we have in this webinar, but if you're, I know this is like very common in camps, if you're a camp counselor, avoid activities that are splitting the group that you're working with into male and female, right? Instead, we suggest you try, there's a vast other array of things you can try, but one example would be split people up into birth months, or if that's going to be like those groups are going to be too small, you could split people up into seasons of that they were born in, kind of larger divisions. We also suggest that if you are planning for an event, you avoid gender-specific dress codes, black tie for men, evening gown for women, and instead you could make it more general and go for like a theme, something like formal attire, festive wear, business casual. It's a little joke on there, just please no flip-flops. We all, no matter your identity, are guilty of wearing flip-flops, so that's kind of a little example.
This is one that's come up a lot to our office, just in terms of folks asking about job interviews and how do I advise students on what to wear, because sometimes these terms like business attire don't translate for folks, or they're not sure what that means. So it might be that you say, blazers, dress pants, skirts, blouses, dress shirts, that you can list different types of clothes, but you don't have to say who is allowed to wear those or not. That this is simply some options that people can take up.
Absolutely. As a psych major, this last point is really salient for me. So if you are submitting if you're, somebody who writes forms or survey information, you're familiar with that, avoid asking participants for their sex in terms of like M or F, and perhaps include other options like a bubble for other, a bubble for something else, or a space where they can self-identify if the binary male, female does not apply to them.
And one person here was asking if UMD has another gender option on the applications. And there are a number of surveys around campus that allow folks to self-identify gender in more ways than two, and also to self-identify sexual orientation in some of those surveys as, again, optional demographic information. Currently, it's not part of the student and employee record system to have more than two options, but that's actually something that we're working towards changing, and there's actually a proposal at the moment before the University Senate on doing so. All right.
So we're going to move into talking about gendering body parts. This kind of gets at the idea that there's biological sex and then there's also gender. And biological sex exists on a spectrum. It's determined by a lot of different factors like secondary sex characteristics, our chromosomes, our hormones, our genitals, our internal sex organs. We're just going to go into like how we can avoid gendering body parts necessarily. So some of the phrases up on screen are things like girls have vaginas and boys have penises, women use oral contraceptives, men use condoms, speaking about reproductive rights as women's reproductive rights, talking about abortion as a woman's right to choose, saying that you wish men menstruated so they could experience that pain, and male and female bodies, right? So when we assign gender to these sex characteristics, such as penises, vaginas, and uteruses, we may exclude or erase the experiences of transgender people. So not all people with penises are men, and not all people with vaginas are women. So even when we speak about these body parts as generalizations to womanhood or manhood, we are leaving out a lot of experiences. So things like talking about menstruation and pregnancy and having working uteruses, these are not experiences that are exclusive to women. A lot of trans men, non-binary people, genderqueer people, and intersex people can menstruate, can conceive, and have uteruses that work, etc. There are also cisgender women who don't menstruate, can't conceive, and have had hysterectomies. So even when we think that we're being encompassing when we say these things, we're really leaving out a lot of experiences, and we're not necessarily saying what we mean. Similarly, having a penis is not exclusive to men. There are trans women, non-binary people, genderqueer, intersex people who also like have a penis. And moving on to the next slide. So earlier I said like these phrases don't actually say what we mean and can leave out a lot of experiences. And so a more effective way of talking about what we want to talk about would just be to name what is important in our discussion. So if we're talking about uteruses, we can say people with uteruses rather than saying this is a women's issue. We're talking all women have like uterine issues, right? If you want to talk about menstruation, you can say people who menstruate rather than all women or all girls. And if you're talking about penises, people with penises, and so on. Just naming what it is you're actually trying to get at in those conversations is much more inclusive and actually much more accurate.
I think part of this is really important, mostly to think about, right? To think about what is it that we really mean when we're saying some of the things that we're saying. It's not to say that you couldn't ever, obviously we want people to talk about women's issues. We want them to talk about men's issues. We want to hear about non-binary issues. We want to hear about trans issues. This is not about getting rid of identities or categories. It's about thinking clearly about what those identities and categories relate to or imply, especially when you're talking about bodies. And the ways that people see their bodies can be very complex. And so this actually plays out in specific instances. For example, if you have a health center and you have a women's health clinic, are some of those services that trans men, for example, might want to access? And if so, how would they know that they can access that? So that this is why that it's important, is that when we name things in ways that aren't quite what we're trying to get at, if it's about bodies rather than about identities and social categories, are folks really going to have access to the right services?
Okay, so now we are going to shift our presentation and talk about a hot topic these days, which is gender inclusive restrooms. So as you can all see, we have a quote on the screen from famous actress and activist Laverne Cox, who actually came to Maryland last spring and gave a beautiful lecture. I won't read it, but anyone can read it at their own leisure. She's basically just saying that access to appropriate bathrooms it's a human rights issue, and it's absolutely vital that everyone has access to a bathroom in which they feel safe and comfortable. So moving forward, transgender individuals are vulnerable to harassment and violence in standard binary bathrooms. And anecdotal and research evidence suggests that trans people face verbal, physical threats, assaults, and even risk facing being arrested when they are using gender-specific facilities. So with that in mind, it's not exactly shocking to understand why using non-gender inclusive bathrooms is a serious source of anxiety and stress for trans people. Students should not have to travel out of their way, often to different buildings, to access a bathroom in which they feel safe and comfortable using. And not having access to a restroom that's appropriate for them throughout the day can lead to serious health problems. On the screen we say UTI, but as like a whole range of health issues associated with not being able to use facilities during the day. So
yeah, I just want to elaborate more on the point of why gender inclusive restrooms are important. So when we don't have gender inclusive restrooms for a lot of trans and gender nonconforming people, this means that they'll have to go out of their way to find a restroom that is something that is accessible to them, or is a place where they can feel safe while relieving themselves. And when these facilities are not available, a lot of us have to structure our day around not having access to a restroom. So for example, a lot of people dehydrate themselves so that they won't have to go and walk like an extra half mile to find a bathroom on campus, or they will not stay on campus for as long as they would if they had access to a restroom. And the lack of these facilities kind of says implies in a way that we can't exist in these public spaces in the same capacity that cisgender and gender conforming people do.
And still at University of Maryland, we're working towards having more and more inclusive restrooms. A lot of that has been over many years now. The practice of the institution has been that any new buildings, any new construction, there'll be at least one single-user, lockable, gender-inclusive restroom. But also that where we have single-user, lockable restrooms, that if they can be made gender neutral, why not? So, all the signage on these restrooms should be gender neutral, gender inclusive. So that's one of the ways that we're working on that. But at the same time, we've found the situation that many, many buildings on campus may be older. They're not brand new buildings in the last 10 years or 5 years. So they don't have enough gender inclusive facilities available.
Yeah, from our preliminary bathroom audit, we found that 38 buildings on University of Maryland's campus have gender inclusive restrooms. That's compared to like over 900 buildings in total.
900 restrooms, perhaps. There's over 100 buildings on campus, though, and so just knowing that the majority of buildings on campus don't have a gender inclusive restroom, obviously that can be a serious issue for folks to have to run around to find something that feels safe enough for them. One other thing I want to mention about restrooms is that certainly trans people, cisgender people, all people have the right to use a restroom, and certainly I think people should be able to use the restroom that corresponds to their gender identity. And that's the principle behind having a gender identity and expression anti-discrimination policy and law. Now, I know that there's a lot of questions, maybe confusion about kind of what's happening right now under the law. So I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice, but I'll tell you kind of how I'm understanding what has been happening. So recently, a couple weeks ago, the Trump administration, through the Department of Education and Department of Justice, rescinded a guidance letter that they had sent out to schools and universities and colleges that had only been created recently, right? In the last couple years under the Obama administration, there was a guidance letter. The letter was meant to help institutions of education to understand what their obligations might be under Title IX. Now, Title IX is a law, and it's a law that's focused on sex discrimination and sex stereotyping in education. And the law has not changed, and the court decisions around the law have not changed. In fact, the original guidances that were sent out were really based upon court decisions and the law, and how those decisions could impact the way that institutions of education should be implementing policy. Now, essentially what they were articulating was that a sex non-discrimination law essentially includes gender identity and expression. And that's been something not just in Title IX, but in federal employment law that other folks have litigated, whether it's in court or have pushed through various equal opportunity commissions. More and more courts and commissions have been deciding that sex could include other things like gender identity and expression, or even sexual orientation, that these could be components of a sex anti-discrimination law. That said, our institution and in the state of Maryland, we have more than just sex anti-discrimination laws. We have a gender identity and expression policy on campus that's an anti-discrimination policy, but there also are gender identity protections in state law in Maryland as well as in local law. We also have protections for personal appearance which usually refers to how people's bodies appear, and that has been used in the past to protect trans people as well. And then we also have sexual orientation protections. So between all these various protections that exist in Maryland on a state level, on a county level, on a University System of Maryland level, and on a University of Maryland College Park level, I just want to say, essentially, we have these protections in place, and they're meant to say you cannot discriminate against someone based on their gender identity and expression. And in my view, that means that that includes restrooms, right? That includes all of our facilities. And so regardless of what is happening on the federal level, we still have these protections. And I think it's important to get that message out there to more folks because, we have been hearing from some people who are very confused and unsure of what any changes or things they're reading in the news may mean. And even some of the things that we're reading in the news aren't quite accurate. They're being described as, the law has changed or the legal protection has changed. And it's more about the federal government's defense of some of those things has changed. Their posturing has changed. There was the Gavin Grimm Supreme Court case that just got sent back down to lower court, and the lower court has been asked to re-look at that and decide it based upon not having the federal administration guidance in place. But that doesn't, mean that they will decide differently, because there's plenty, I think, there's plenty of things in as far as other cases, as far as the direct legal argument of what's in the law, that they may decide exactly the same. But regardless of all of that, we still have these gender identity and expression protections in the state of Maryland. Are there questions? Are there other comments from the students, from the peer educators here? Are there questions from those of you listening in, particularly relative to bathrooms? I see someone starting to type, but let me just ask, what do you all think about safety concerns generally in restrooms? I know that whenever we talk about restrooms, somebody is usually bound to say, well, I'm concerned about my safety, and what does trans people using restrooms have to do with that? Does it have something to do with that? What do you all think?
So I think this question of safety in the restrooms doesn't really pertain to trans people being there or not. So when trans people go to the restroom, they're there to do the same things that you do in a restroom, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. And I feel like whether we exclude trans people from restrooms or not, if someone wants to harm you in a restroom, the label on the door will not stop them. It's kind of like a myth of safety that this might provide, just thinking that if a trans woman's in my restroom, she's just like a man pretending to be a woman so she can get at me where I'm vulnerable. Like there isn't an extra security system that happens when you say this is just a women's restroom and imply that it's for only cis women, etc. I also will say that some people think that if we create more gender inclusive bathrooms or convert more bathrooms to gender inclusive bathrooms, that it's us taking away their bathrooms. And I just want to reiterate that gender inclusive bathrooms can be used by everyone, whether or not they are not just trans specific bathrooms. Again, they're just gender inclusive bathrooms without gender designation.
Right. And trans people, could identify as men or women or non-binary. But trans folks may want to use gender-specific restrooms, and that should be available to folks as well, and not forced into using, some special restroom that only trans people are supposed to use. Mm-hmm. So that's not a thing. That's not what we're trying to build. And I think safety issues-wise, like you said, I think there's a false notion that what sign you put on a door or what policy that you have is the thing that creates safety. I think the reality is that safety isn't it's not necessarily about what somebody looks like and that they happen to need to go pee. It's really about are people behaving in inappropriate ways? Are they trying to take video of people or attack someone? And whatever sign you put on a door or whatever policy you have does not prevent that, right? But there are still, I think, legitimate safety concerns that people might have, not just in restrooms, right? But throughout campus, there have been issues of sexual assaults or other offenses that people should be vigilant and thoughtful about, but they're not limited to restrooms by any means, and have happened in many different kinds of places. Um, there was a question here about what would be the correct language for signage on gender-inclusive bathrooms. That's also something that generally you want that to be gender inclusive, so it's got to be a term like restroom or bathroom or something like that. We don't, our office doesn't necessarily recommend that you say unisex or something like that, although there are some restrooms on campus that say that. You might say gender inclusive to emphasize that anyone can use it. But restroom, I think, could be perfectly acceptable. Some of this could also be something that may need more of a uniform policy for campus, and so that may be something that we'll look towards, is what are ways that we can have more uniformity. Similarly, the signage and whatever symbols that you put on it, you might have to think about, instead of putting the male-female kind of symbol or man-woman symbol, which implies that there's only two genders, what more campuses have been doing is putting symbols of what the room is for. So putting a symbol that looks like a toilet or a hand washing or sink or something like that tends to be the direction. Yeah, and so having a more, as one of the comments here is that having a uniform policy or guidance could be helpful. So I think that's definitely a potential direction here for this campus. The other question was about the bathroom audit, that there are 38 gender-neutral restrooms. Does that include residence halls? I would say, first of all, I'm not sure about that number, to be honest. There's been many different looks into the restrooms. You would have to ask facilities management for what those numbers look like, but I don't know that residence halls fall under that. So that may be a totally separate thing. And I know that resident life and residential facilities have looked at, especially for new facilities, building more gender-inclusive facilities that are really helpful to having different kinds of living situations for students available. But we still have many older buildings where there are not so many options available. We're going to just mention a couple resources. The LGBT Equity Center, please feel free to come visit us, but check out our website. So it's lgbt.umd.edu, and where you might have signed up for this training, but where you can find out more about these trainings is rainbowterps.umd.edu, and that takes you to the part of our website that gets into some of those details. We'll also be eventually putting these recordings online under the Rainbow Terps website. Another important one is trans.umd.edu, and that will take you to the part of our center's website that really gives you more resources, particularly on campus policies. How does somebody change their name? How does somebody get their gender or sex marker changed? Those you can find at trans.umd.edu. And then there's another website you might check out, which is mypronouns.org, that goes into some of these more detailed examples of, hey, I made a mistake. How do I correct myself? What do some of these pronouns mean? And you can find a lot more resources there. And when we put this online, this recording of this session online, we'll also have some additional links and resources paired with it. I want to open for some Q&A. There is one, as you're typing in any questions that you have, one question already was, are there Rainbow Terp stickers available at the office? The answer is yes, absolutely. We would love to give you some stickers. You can find us in 2218 Marie Mount Hall, and we have some beautiful Rainbow Terp stickers we would love to give you.
Perfect for doors.
Yes.
Binders, notebooks.
Water bottles.
Water bottles.
Clipboards.
Laptops.
Vehicles.
Anything. Everything and anything.
What other questions do y'all have? Because I know we covered a couple of key areas around pronouns, gendered language and assumptive language, and restrooms, but are there other things in our last couple minutes that we have that you'd like to know a little bit more about? While folks are typing, let me just ask the peer educators here, what would you like folks to know? What else can create a more trans-inclusive campus for people?
Well, one thing that I know I appreciate from trans allies when they navigate pronouns is that they not only learn about how to ask for pronouns and normalize the practice of introducing themselves with pronouns and asking for others, is for them to shift the way they think about pronouns. So pronouns are things that we can't tell just by looking at someone, the way that you can't tell someone's name by looking at someone. The way we've been socialized around gender is to kind of look at someone and evaluate if their appearance is feminine enough to use she, her pronouns or masculine enough to use he, him pronouns. I think actively challenging that instinct when you encounter new people and instead telling yourself to use they, them pronouns until I have learned what this person's pronouns are. Being very intentional about the way you're approaching this mentally is something that is very appreciated. It's not a concrete like policy or practice, but it is something that will help you avoid making the mistake of repeatedly misgendering someone.
Mhm.
And as Max was talking about, definitely interactions, one-on-one interactions, it's definitely really great to see people normalizing this process of asking pronouns, saying your own pronouns, but also in terms of just the classroom environment as well. Like definitely on the first couple of days while everyone's introducing themselves, it definitely creates an environment that is going to solidify throughout the entire semester of creating a more open environment where people can feel free to express themselves in any way they can and might are willing to do. And so, as a professor, if any professors listening, it's something to think about in terms of like in ways to reintroduce the classroom. Um,
There are just a few other practices that I've seen during my time at the University of Maryland that made me feel better about my time at the University of Maryland. One of which was when I lived in the residence halls. My RA, during our initial meetings at the beginning of the semester, she said, I'd like to get to know all of you more. If there's anything you want to tell me about, like identity or what I should refer to you as, just leaving that out there as a broad general address to the group and not necessarily singling anyone out or like forcing them to tell. That is something that was really
Mhm.
welcoming for me, and also including links to like the LGBT Equity Center or other resources on your syllabi as professors is also a great way to state that your classroom will be an inclusive environment. Pronouns in your email signatures, just stuff like that.
Great. Um, and so keep in mind that, trans inclusion is not only about these couple things that we've talked about, it's a lot of things. There has been national research that has found that trans students may be receiving less mentorship or support, particularly trans women, from faculty, for example. And so really just, talking to people, treating people as human. I think I've heard from students that they don't feel like some students do not feel that they've been treated just like a human being. So even doing the outreach, mentoring people, that doesn't mean you have to talk about trans issues and somebody's identity, as much as noticing when folks might be left out or not really included in a situation. I want to really briefly wrap us up. We've only got 2 minutes left. There were a couple more questions. One was about changing signage in your own building. That may be something to follow up, and our office will be happy to chat with you about. And yes, our peer educators are part of a Speakers Bureau program. They do classroom presentations primarily in the fall, but also may be available in the spring. So we would welcome you to check that out. And you can find more info on our website that Sika has just posted for you. And then finally, a couple of action steps you might take. Reviewing this session recording and additional resources. You might need more clarification on what some of what we just talked about means, and being mindful of our own language and behaviors. Certainly, you can visit our center and you can get those stickers to display. There are additional learning opportunities, and then we'll also email out an evaluation about this. One of the additional learning opportunities is coming up very soon, which is a webinar on LGBTQ plus people of color and intersectionality. And then there's also another one in April